U.S. involved internationally from what I call the carbon spheres. So I'm going to present a framework for viewing it, and then I'm going to compare becoming aware about environmental problems to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of death and dying.
Okay. And we'll see how that works. Okay. The first major sphere in which the United States affects the carbon load of the world is through direct physical impacts.
Oh. Just move the mouse off of it and try clicking. And you click, there you go. Now your arrows should work.
Okay, where's the thing that makes it go? Okay,
I would just click one more and then use your arrows, your arrow keys. There you go.
Okay, the direct physical impacts are the four. These are actually there's 5 spheres that you can view the planet on. One is the cultural sphere, one is the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the biosphere. Okay. So if you add the cultural sphere, you've got, if I say spheres too much, I fear that I will get tongue-tied, but the carbon spheres reflect through these 4 major cycles in addition to the cultural sphere. So things like literal affecting in the world's oceans, and when we talk about oceans, and when we talk about biodiversity, just before every major species collapse, the yield becomes the peak, which makes sense if you look at a curve. But when you interview the people who are doing the harvesting, if you look at the weight and volume of the harvest is always at its highest, but the age and the age declines and the size declines, so the individual numbers increase. So what ends up happening is whatever species you're harvesting, you're getting more of them, and they're smaller and they're younger. And so if you go by tonnage, like every single major species of fish that gets harvested, turns out that the sheer tonnage is high, but they're smaller. Some of the environmental archaeology work I do with Nathan Hamilton, we're out at the Isle of Shoals, and we find the bones of cod that are 60, 80, 90 pounds. So there's some 5-foot long cod there. They have a skull there that's about this big, and that is from the 16th century. So as the cod continue to decline, we decide there's really nothing wrong with them, but scientists reading ahead or looking at that are going, well, let's go to the next species. So then we decide we'll get people to like another kind of species, another fish, because we're working our way down to the bottom of the sea as we pull up the ground dwellers and we eat those, and then they get close to collapse. And so we have direct physical impacts on land, desertification. Every year we lose an area to desert that's the size of the landmass of Kansas. We export hazardous materials, so we have direct physical through things that we send out. So we've got air, water, land, biosphere, and cultural sphere. The next major... Okay, so we have the direct physical responses that we can do to something like that. And in this case here, there's a person kayaking among one of the ocean gyres. And the gyres are now there permanently. You can walk on them because they have so much trash on them. And they are mapped. Some of them are 30 miles across. And so these are when you get a confluence of current, like when you see a whirlpool, you have giant major currents that go all over the world, and as they get together and swirl like that, they create kind of like a whirlpool, back eddy like that, and that's why that trash stays there. The trade issues is the second major area of impact through direct trade that we have with other countries. And of course, this is governed by our 3 horse people. More, faster, and cheaper. We focus on a product too, and we focus on a single resource. And we have done this through environmental regulation. In the past 30 years, the EPA and other regulatory bodies have shifted to ecosystem. But in terms of trade issues, we govern on the basis of what product can we get from another country? What single issue do we deal with? And what this ends up doing is it ends up neglecting an ecosystem. And we have import and export policies. The pesticides that we don't want to use, that we don't allow, we will sell to another country like Mexico, and then we will get them back on the stuff we buy from Mexico. This is called, by environmental science, the ring of poison, as it comes back on things. And part of this is due to the choices. Like we do what I call the melons in winter syndrome. So we decide we want the same thing year-round. And if we want the same foods year-round, we have to pay to get that stuff to come to us. So I illustrated the horseman for you. Now, the third major category is through international law. International environmental law are derived out of maritime. So the great age of exploration gave rise to deciding what ships would do when they met other ships. As you may know, in the 19th century, the British idea of what to do when you met another ship was to take all their sailors and impress them. Okay? Because the British were trying to leave England because of a problem with the food. That was my joke, right? Because if you eat food in London, you go like, oh, I get it. Now I know why they went everywhere else. Okay, so the other major thing we have is ISO 14000. Does anyone know what ISO 14000 is?
Never heard of it.
It is the major principle of manufacturing. Hi, Nan. And it is the environmental accountability that's used in manufacturing. ISO 9000 is the original system that was introduced about 30 years ago, and what it was done is to improve standardization of parts. Some of you may have heard in the 19th century, one railroad company started a railroad in the Pacific Coast and the other Atlantic. When they met, they were the wrong gauge. Well, manufacturers decided they didn't want to have this problem, so they incorporated a principle of standardization. And the standardization meant if you got a 1024 thread machine flathead screw that came from Germany or Japan or Korea, it would meet certain specs that would make it be more interchangeable. So what they did was they added cradle to grave environmental accountability aspect to that, and that's what ISO 14000 does. And the interesting thing is, because we're not in the European Union, and most of our trade, we go to the store and we buy things that are made in China, but we don't on a daily basis decide to drive through 6 countries like you could in Europe if you were on a sales tour. So we just don't have awareness of some of these international systems. The third major thing in international environmental law, aside from specific laws, is the system of environmental impact assessment. And this is the system of projecting future impacts, discussing them, and using them to make a planning decision about it. When we deal with any large projects like dams or in IMF, International Monetary Fund, any major bankroll project tends to call in some kind of environmental assessment, accountability, which now includes things like environmental justice, and it includes climate change. And here I have illustrated, here's a big ship traveling, and this is how ships travel and carry goods. Giant container ships carry these containers. These containers are lifted lock, stock, and barrel right off and put on the docks, and this is why you get invasive species and all kinds of other things. It doesn't matter what you do to fumigate. When you have systems that are this large, moving big things like that, you're going to get whatever little critters are in there. And people don't realize this, but the average human has 23 different species on them, and I'm not talking about the tiny little ones you can't see. And the average house has 360 different species living in it, one of which are the humans. So a container ship and a container being brought over, that's why we got the Asian longhorn beetle and various other things that are right here in Maine. I won't gross you out with more talk about the different species on the individual human. Some of us may have less than others. But it's about promoting a kind of justice in equitable transmission of goods, and about things like international protection, a ban on exotic or endangered species. United States has, in 1969, Richard M. Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act into being. This law is the federal accountability of different decisions that we make that involve construction, any sort of land management policy, shipping, transport of waste. 23 different states have a state equivalent of that. Maine does not. And over 100 countries have borrowed this environmental accountability process and created their own. The European Union has its own system for deciding what environmental impacts are and projecting the cost of those and deciding trade-offs. Along with that particular piece of legislation, the other thing we export and then we import is our own human values, which relates to those horsemen of production and the idea of what do Americans expect? How do we behave as consumers? This includes things like the population and the moral issues of birth control. And just in case you don't know how that works, Tyler, this is how it works. There's a drawing for you.
Thank you, Rob. Obviously, I need your help on that
arena. You're young. Okay. And other categories of impact involve carbon. What do we expect for packaging? Like if you look at what sells something, it has to be bright. It has to be lots of heavy packaging to prevent people from stealing it and sticking it in their pocket. It's got to, we feel like it's a better bargain if it's more containerized and personalized. As a result of that and our own expectations, the typical food on an American table has traveled 1,300 kilometers. And in my Intro to Environmental Science class, we do a little breakfast interview where we figure out who ate what and where did it come from. A couple times, the Aramark will try to have a local food section, and we've had local food production and served it to students. A lot of blueberries. Okay. Blueberry has 98% of what the acai dairy has for antioxidants. And you see these exotic, expensive sale stuff. Just eat high or low bush blueberries. You get the best. So there are impacts as a result of our food, not just the food itself, but its harvest, its manufacturing, its travel, what was displaced for it to be grown. The fact that Ty here is in my chicken class, and our chicken and farm policies favor giant farms, not small, locally produced farms. Most major corporate decisions are geared towards big federal policies like that. And air. Air is another thing that it doesn't know it has a political boundary, and the discharges are supposed to stop when it gets to the edge of the United States and not continue on. We have known about acid rain. Sweden published articles about acid rain in the 1950s. Scientists have known about acid rain since they first, 200 or 300 years ago, started to notice the erosion of the features on Greek and Roman statues. So, but we want, if we got the benefit of the Industrial Revolution to, at an environmental cost, which we were able to make some restoration, other countries want the same thing. So in the Philippines, they are still using leaded gasoline, and other countries that are doing those same kind of things that emit stuff, toxics into the air, are saying whenever the United States wants to ban those things, they're saying, you had yours, you got to build up your economy and got this high standard of living. We want this chance. How come you guys get to do it, we don't? So we're going to do that. So that is a big, major international issue with the United States and interacting with other countries. Manufacturing. Many of you may remember the incidents that occurred in the 80s when people would discuss how the soccer balls were sewn by small children because they could do the tiny stitches, and so the International Soccer Association decided they weren't going to use those. But if you will occasionally hear about major companies, department stores buying from other countries that just don't have the child labor laws. The child is an economic asset, and if you need more economic assets, you have more kids. So you get more kids out there and doing things and working for you, and the odds might increase that one of them has a good chance to help support the family. So we kind of create incentives, market incentives, that increase population and decrease accountability. So the shopping that we do around for that, as we export our global responsibilities, what we do is we export the impacts and import the benefits. The cheapest sites are where the accountability is the least, because environmental stuff costs money in the short term, and countries are not looking at the long-term costs of environmental accountability. Bhopal, for example, if they had put $1 million worth of plant safety that they would have had to do had that been in the United States, that would have saved the 5,000 to 15,000 people that were killed and the $4.1 billion in damage. That 40 tons of this one pesticide that leaked out. So again, this is due to our desire for more things faster and cheaper. So there's a treadmill, and they're going in opposite directions. We're all behaving like cows who wear socks. I was going somewhere, and I guess I didn't quite get there. But what is our response to this? It's the lone knight of sustainability. And I went to Clarkson, so I knew the knight was their mascot. So I actually found the Green Knight Certified Sustainability. That Clarkson, which is in upstate New York, is trying to do. So that's our response, is sustainability. So what do we do to promote sustainability? Why we turn to a professor in education and we say to him, hello,
Dad.
a sustainably packed, a refillable cup, and a brown bag. That's very good. Our responses include an ecosystem notion of trade and resource management. This is where environmental science needs to be nice to the people in business. And this is where we get together and start talking about the ecological concept. We already have the ecosystem concept of development and the cradle-to-grave accountability for products, food, and construction. So we're getting these ecological principles writ large. We need this international environmental ethics, where I mentioned the circle of poison. We now, 90% of our food in the world comes from 15 plant species and 8 animal species. So that's a lot of eggs in one basket. So we are already working with different varieties of rice. There are some 15,000 different varieties of rice being developed, but that rice is one species. We had, if you were here 5,000 years ago, it would be amaranth, chenopodium, and helianthus would be the major foods. We have some helianthus now, but that's about it. So we have to think about this lipoethics. We have to think about population, full cost pricing, having the cost of disposal put in on things. We need to slow down the treadmill. And this is where it calls for value and ethics. And having taught environmental science for years, I began to realize I was just depressing students if I wasn't careful. And I would feel good about it because I took them past the denial about there being environmental problems, which is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's first stage of death and dying awareness. So I get them to the second stage, and then they just get angry. Okay. So I have some students, and if I did a real good job teaching, they went from denial to anger. Okay, end of the semester. And now I'm realizing, at the time I realized, I got to get them past that. I got to give them something to do so I tried to do a little bit better job, and then they start negotiating. Well, what if we did this? What if the government did that? And so I'm going, okay. So a few more years went by, and I worked harder on my teaching, and then I just got them to stage 4, which is depression. So they were done being angry, they were done bargaining, and they were just depressed. Well, so now what I try to do is when I'm teaching about environmental awareness, I try to go through all 5 stages. So I get them through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, all the way to acceptance. And acceptance is the planet itself doesn't really care if there's humans or not. The planet itself doesn't care if it's got low biodiversity or not. not, because it's got huge potential. It's got 4 billion more years. It can, or it falls into the sun. So it can wait things out and try stuff, but everybody's environmental stage is a personal one, and people need to come to terms in their own lives so that they won't be angry, so that they won't be miserable. And Edward Abbey says, if you're going to do things for the environment, you've got to save half your energy and strength for yourself. And he was basically talking about sustainability. So we all have to think about our own personal choices and our own personal reactions. Sometimes, like in my case, I bought a Nissan Leaf, and it's a 100% electric car, and I know that from a carbon standpoint, that thing is loaded up the wazoo with carbon. But if nobody ever buys electric vehicles, then they won't work on making them better. So to me, that's something that I did not to save my energy costs now, but as an investment. And that's a personal choice, and I think everybody has to make their own personal choice in a way that gets them past depression. And that's my talk.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions?
I missed the title of your talk.
For